And so I'm glad to be able to introduce someone who has added her voice to the issues facing Israel as it confronts this terror. Senator Hillary Clinton.
Thank you very much, Mort, and thank you all for convening this important show of solidarity on behalf of Israel, the people of Israel, freedom-loving people and democracies everywhere. I want to thank the Conference of Presidents. I want to thank all the organizations, UJC, Israel Now and Forever, UJA, JCRC, 92nd Street Y, and those of you who are here with us at the Y and others who are throughout our country and indeed throughout the world. You know, just 3 weeks ago I was in Israel, and I had an opportunity at that time to convey the support and solidarity that New Yorkers and Americans feel toward Israel, not just at this moment, but before and in many ways in the future, to demonstrate clearly that we stand with Israel now and forever. And when I met with the people on the streets, outside Sbarro Pizza where I went, at Hadassah Hospital, throughout Jerusalem, I conveyed the same support and solidarity that we are here demonstrating today. Similarly, when meeting with the Prime Minister, with the Defense Minister, with the Foreign Minister and government officials, I made clear that we in the United States counted on our government, the American government, to stand with Israel now and forever, just as the people of America stand with Israelis. Today, I am here not only as a United States Senator, not only as someone who has been to Israel 7 times, who has tried over 20-plus years always to support the government and people of Israel, but as an American citizen with one singular message. The United States and Israel face a common threat. Make no mistake about it. The attack on the United States here in New York and at the Pentagon on September 11th comes from the same well of hatred and evil that stalks Israel. It is not possible for us to imagine in any way confronting and winning the war against terrorism here and abroad without helping Israel to win it at home. Many of you know that during my husband's administration, I did everything I could to support 4 successive governments of Israel, because I believed then, as I believe now, that it is not for the United States to dictate to Israel the best way for Israel to defend itself and her people. And we therefore have to be ready, as we expect our allies and friends to do, to support the governments we elect. And we stand with this government of Israel. And make no mistake about it, as Israel defends herself, it does so because it is clear she has no alternative. The collapse of any effort to try to achieve a safe and secure resolution of the disputes that the Palestinians have with Israel and the ensuing violence rests solely on the shoulders of Yasser Arafat. And I want to be very clear about this. The responsibility for the violence and the collapse of the Camp David and Taba discussions rests only with Yasser Arafat. He has failed. He has failed as a leader. He has been unable and unwilling to rein in the forces of violence and terrorism. It leaves a trail of violated vows and deaths along a path that could have and should have led to peace and life. We know that he continues to exploit children in pursuit of his own aims, whether it is the textbooks that he permits to be used in the classrooms of the Palestinian Authority, or the encouragement for young suicide bombers. The use of children to further violence and political aims is absolutely unforgivable and needs to be condemned as such. And we know something else, don't we? We know that the violence permitted and encouraged by Arafat can still be ended by Arafat. If he were to choose today to renounce terrorism and other acts of violence, he could demonstrate in both English and Arabic that it is not just rhetorical support, but it is action that counts. He can and he must apprehend, prosecute, and imprison and keep imprisoned known terrorists. And most importantly, especially because of what has happened the last several weeks, he must be held responsible for those groups that act in his name. That means Force 17, his own special security force. It means Tanzim, the armed wing of Fatah. He failed to dissolve the Al-Aqsa brigades, and this week we learned what that meant. And I think he has to be made to understand that the United States, all civilized nations, stand with Israel in having zero tolerance for terrorism. If he won't do it, then it will be done with his agreement and support or not. And let me add a word about the latest developments concerning Iran and Arafat. When I was in Jerusalem, I spoke about my deep concern that the relationship between the Palestinians and the Iranian government was deepening. At that time, the evidence that I had came, of course, as we all know, from the interception of the Karine A and the discovery of the boatload of weapons on their way to the Palestinian Authority, and some intelligence reports concerning Iranian involvement with the Palestinians. Well, we know today from the front page of the New York Times that Iran and Arafat have forged a secret connection. The arms shipment aboard the Karine A, loaded with 50 tons of illegal weapons, mostly manufactured in Iran, is unfortunately not the only problem that we now face with respect to Iranian sponsorship of terrorism and even greater involvement on behalf of the Palestinians. This effort to forge an alliance with a patron saint or patriot state of terror is something that deeply concerns us. Arafat's alliance with Iran represents a dangerous collaboration not only for Israel but for all of us. It is true that the axis of evil that included Iran is something that directly impacts our security, and now we know more clearly than ever that it directly is aimed at the heart of Israel as well. Despite the efforts of some within Iran to make reform in the government, and despite, from everything we know, the desire of young people in Iran to rid themselves of the yoke of a religious tyranny, the fact remains that Iran is the most active state sponsor of terrorism in the world. Therefore, this latest news must be taken seriously, not only in the American capital, not only in Israel, but in Europe. The Europeans must recognize that Iran poses a threat to all of us. The hard truth is that we are now engaged in a global effort against terrorism that is aimed at any democracy, aimed at any freedom-loving people. It is a dangerous time for Israel, but I would add, my friends, it is also a dangerous time for the United States. And we need to recognize that our support for Israel, our friendship, the relationships that many of us have with family and others in Israel, that is not only an important commitment because of who Israel is, because of what we have in common with Israel, but it is part of our global effort to try to combat terrorism. The other day I signed a letter to the President and Vice President Cheney along with Senator Schumer saying that we did not believe that Vice President Cheney should meet with Yasser Arafat at this time. And the reason I signed that letter is because we have seen no movement whatsoever from Arafat. We have not seen the kind of action that sends any message that should be a sign of times to come where there can be a resumption of efforts to try to implement Tenet or Mitchell. Just as we never should do anything to encourage terrorism, we cannot reward the status quo. We cannot say, meet with Arafat and get nothing in return for that meeting. Therefore, I hope that the President and the Vice President will think long and hard before they have such a meeting, unless and until there is definite movement that everyone can agree represents a change of direction on behalf of Arafat. And I hope all of us, as we stand together with Israel, as we defend our democracies, will do so with the spirit of not only resolve that I saw in Israel, but also hope. You know, talking of hope at a time like this may seem naive, it may seem out of place, but I know later in the program you'll hear from my wonderful friend Elie Wiesel, who has said on numerous occasions, there is no alternative for a free people than hope. We cannot give in to fatalism and pessimism. That hands our adversaries a victory. We have to be smart, hard-headed, tough-minded, and focused. But we have to believe that if we are, we will see our way clear to a better future. When I got to Jerusalem, I had many experiences that I will carry with me for the rest of my life. Two in particular I would just leave you with, because I don't think yet today we in America do a good enough job of telling Israel's story to the world. If you go to Hadassah Hospital, what do you see? You see people being taken care of no matter who they are or where they come from. I visited two young soldiers, both victims of the most horrific suicide bombing, bombs filled with nails and nuts and bolts designed to do the maximum injury to these young people. And one of the soldiers was still in very serious condition. His mother asked me to come see him, and his father was on one side of the bed, his mother on the other. And his father showed me pictures of his son before the bombing. You know, a handsome, bright-eyed young man doing his service not only for his country, but for freedom. And as I was about to leave, one of the surgeons said, "Well, I'm sorry you didn't get to meet the doctor who's taking care of this young soldier. He's a Palestinian." Then I went and met with some other victims. And one of the other victims was another young soldier, an Ethiopian who'd been brought to Israel for safety and who grew up loving Israel, loving being reunited with his Jewish traditions and beliefs, and was on duty when he saw a suicide bomber. And just like our brave firefighters here in New York, he ran toward that bomber and threw himself on him and absorbed the shock of the bomb. Now, what does that tell us about this country we stand with and defend? There's no place else in that region where you would have refugees from Ethiopia taken in and assimilated and made part of the society. There's no place else where you'd have a hospital largely supported by Americans, where Israeli and Palestinian doctors work side by side caring for victims, both Arab and Israeli. So anytime anybody says anything to me about Israel, I ask them, where else is there a democracy, anywhere in that part of the world, that believes in freedom and human dignity and human rights? And where else would you have it exemplified as I saw it in that hospital? That's what we are fighting for and fighting against. The evil that stalks Israel and stalks the world, that believes it owns the truth and dismisses the rights and dignity of fellow human beings, must be stopped. And I hope all of us will do everything we can to make sure not just the people who are in this auditorium, but people throughout America, Jew and non-Jew alike, understand that when we stand up for Israel, we are standing up for fundamental human beliefs, democracy, freedom, and America. Thank you all very much. Thank you.